So happy to see so many of you on Tuesday night. It makes our presenters, makes all of us happy. So thank you so much. So I'm here just for a little bit of housekeeping. As always, whenever we have a book, Buxton Books is in the back selling the book. So please support these men, support us, support them. They'll be personalizing after. They're signed now, so please see them. Also, you don't think your cell phone's going to go off. Your cell phone's going to go off, so please take a moment to silence your cell phone. I'm going to wait all of 4 seconds. Okay. Other than, yeah. There's music. That music, that's it there. Perfect example. We're happy to have this program here tonight. It falls pretty much firmly within the purview of our recently rediscovered original motto, which is Et artes transmare currente, or, if you don't know Latin, including me, and the arts ran across the sea. So we're happy to feature something so perfectly meshed with that. To do the true introduction tonight, invaluable friend to the library, board member Carl Weiss.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we're very pleased to have Jacob Steere-Williams and Blake Scott from the College of Charleston. First off, raise your hand if this is your first time at the Charleston Library Society. A couple of people. So for those of you who don't know, the Charleston Library Society was founded in 1748. It is the oldest institution of higher learning or cultural institution in the South. It is the second oldest lending library in the United States. It is extremely old. It is so old, in fact, that the College of Charleston, which is a colonial college, was invented by the Library Society 30 years after its founding. So my name is Carl Wise. I'm a trustee here at the Charleston Library Society, and I'm also an associate professor of Hispanic Studies at the College of Charleston and associate director of the Carolina Low Country and Atlantic World Program. There's the rest of us right there. As Director Sandy Slater. And we are very grateful to host two of my esteemed colleagues from the College of Charleston, Jacob Steere-Williams and Blake Scott, to discuss their new book, Port Cities of the Atlantic World. To open their volume, they open it with a telling quote from Frederick Morgan. Quote, "The history of ports is, in great measure, the history of civilization." Unpacking this quote, Steere-Williams and Scott explain that, quote, "The Atlantic world ports were more than points of departure and sites of arrival. Port cities connected physically, politically, biologically, epistemologically, land and sea, ships and plantation, town and country. They were contact zones, sites of cultural, biological creolization." And indeed, we can see this idea written into the very fabric of the Charleston Library Society, whose motto, adopted after 1748, is Et artes trans mare currunt. The arts ran across the sea. This volume for the Carolina Low Country and Atlantic World Program and for the College of Charleston represents the culmination of scholarship and programming from a momentous year, 2020. It was the 350th anniversary of Charleston, the 250th anniversary of the College of Charleston, and the 25th anniversary of the Carolina Low Country and Atlantic World Program. However, like has happened so many other times in Charleston's history, our port city became a pathological contact zone with COVID-19, and we were unfortunately unable to host many of our anniversary port city conferences and other events. But thankfully, we can still celebrate all of that scholarship with this recently published volume, Port Cities of the Atlantic World, which brings together a collection of essays that examine a centuries-long transatlantic transportation of people, goods, and ideas with a focus on the impact of trade and what would become the American South. Blake Scott, the editors, Blake Scott is an associate professor of international studies at the College of Charleston and is the author of Unpacked, A History of Caribbean Tourism from Cornell University Press. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Environmental History, the Journal of Tourism History, the Huffington Post, and the Post and Courier. Outside of campus, he's also very involved in local conservation organizations which maintain and help protect our waterways and marshes around Charleston. Jacob Steere-Williams, raise your hand, He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and an associate professor of history at the College of Charleston. And he's also president of the Waring Historical Library at MUSC. Is the author of the 2000 book, The Filth Disease, Typhoid Fever and Practices of Epidemiology in Victorian England, from Rochester Press, a volume which catapulted him to fame as a pandemic historian in 2020. And so he has appeared in the Post and Courier, the Washington Post, also LA Times, CNN, Time Magazine, the British Medical Journal. So here to talk about their wonderful new volume, Jacob Steere-Williams and Blake Scott.
Blake and I have known Carl long enough to know all of those remarks are undeserving, but we appreciate them nonetheless, Carl. Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you here this evening at the Charleston Library Society. It's the second time that I've been here in the last couple years to talk about the book that Carl mentioned over there in the back, and to be joined with my dear friend and colleague and fellow historian Blake Scott to talk about this volume that we've put together and to talk about Charleston. You know, a lot of books these days have humble beginnings and they turned into ostentatious products. This book started rather ostentatiously, as Carl mentioned, with this big Port Cities conference, and is the humble product of it. I brought to share with everyone today that I found in a corner of my office a mug that we had put together for the 2020 Port Cities Conference, the conference that never happened as a result of the pandemic. What we have to show for it instead is this book, but a little bit of material history. Again, we're historians, so this will be an artifact that will live on long after probably this book will, but I thought y'all would enjoy this mug. I'm going to turn it over to Blake to get us started here.
I'd like to start with a historical reflection. Can you hear me? Okay. Is the mic on now? Are we good now? Okay. I'd like to start with an historical reflection. I've lived here now 7 years. I grew up in Florida, south of the South in a way. My orientations were to the Caribbean as opposed to thinking about the U.S. South. I showed up here, a job at the College of Charleston, that's what brought me. And buzzing around the city was a name and a person you all are very familiar with in terms of their story, Denmark Vesey. Right? I maybe mispronounce Vesey depending on how local you are. Some people say Vesey, is that right? Or Vesey?
Vesey.
Vesey. Yeah. As I said, I'm from Florida, right? And there was so much reflection about Denmark and his role in the slave rebellion, the largest slave rebellion that never happened in U.S. history, and the importance of thinking about that story for reconciliation, the role of slavery, and how to make amends or make up for Charleston's history. And I began to think about this, and the questions I asked were, well, who did this to this man? What is the story behind this family that would enslave this person? And then you begin to break down someone's name. Where does the name Denmark come from? It's from the Caribbean. He was in the Danish Virgin Islands when he was enslaved. Where does the last name come from? He comes from a boat captain out of Bermuda by the name of Joseph Vesey, Captain Joseph, who lived here in Charleston. So right there you have a transnational story that's not only about Charleston, but its connections with other Caribbean islands and across the Atlantic world. Jacob and I decided, okay, it's time to investigate this some more. Could you go to the next slide? We went to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, and we began to trace out this family name and see who was involved. September 1783, a ship arrives to Charleston carrying 104 enslaved individuals from an unspecified port in West Africa. The journey began with 126 individuals. So what happened to those 22 people? Based on historical records, we can assume that they were lost at sea, the deprivations, the tragedy of slavery. When those African individuals arrive in bondage to Charleston, they're likely quarantined on Sullivan's Island, and they're handed over to another boat captain And this is where the Vesey family comes back, Captain Joseph Vesey, who's in charge of the sale of these individuals. For the folks who think about Charleston's history and its relationship to the U.S. history, September 1783, what also happens that same month? The Treaty of Paris, the end of the American Revolution and the beginning of American freedom, the fight for liberty. So side by side, we have a slave ship arriving into Charleston the same month that the United States also has achieved their own sense of liberty and freedom. And right there, these are the twin contradictions, or very much shaping each other, defining one another, the relationship between liberty and bondage, or freedom and injustice, that we wanted to pursue in this volume. Now, it's not just about this that we're thinking about, but that was a fundamental question that we wanted to get at. Could you go to the next slide for us? Here's some of the other historical records. We went into the newspapers and archives trying to trace out this story. Could you go to the next one for me? Now, the story of slavery, it still needs to be told and needs to be analyzed and re-examined over and over again until we can figure out the accumulation of the issues we're still dealing with. But there are other elements of Charleston's history and its relationship to the Atlantic world that we think should be talked about. And when you do this, perhaps you can begin to reimagine the story, that it's possible for a sense of place to be progressive, not self-enclosing and defensive, trying to constantly defend itself against the injustice of the past, but outward-looking. How can we retrace these routes and these routes which have defined the place that now we call home? And through that analysis of patterns, we can see the accumulation into the present. I'm an historian of the 20th century. I care about how history is shaped now, and I care about how it's going to shape the future. We saw this volume as a potential avenue for people to dive slowly into this history in a collective collage with other contributors to think about what do we want our port and our position on the Atlantic coast to be in the future. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Blake. I want to share a couple things from the beginning of this volume, from the introductory chapter that Blake and I wrote. And I'll start with a quote that we did not write, and a little bit of a test this evening, if anybody knows their literature. Like Venice, Charleston City seems growing out of the waves. Charleston people love their seaside walk, for the heat bursts on you here, as from a burning fiery furnace suddenly thrown open. And all beyond the Ashley River, among the white cotton fields, the heat is African, as the laborers are also. Does anyone know who wrote that? Charles Dickens wrote that in 1861. In his magazine, he was back in London all year round. And he wrote it shortly after South Carolina had seceded and shortly before shots rang out on Fort Sumter. And in fact, he was reflecting on his first visit to the U.S. in the late 1840s, and he was reflecting on Charleston. And this imagery that Dickens evokes, that Charleston seems to grow out of the waves, it struck me as we were thinking about this project as something that I've known. I've lived in Charleston for a little over a decade now, and I've always seen Charleston, again, someone who's not from here but has lived here now for a good portion of my life, and someone who's a historian. My background is in British history, and certainly this city grew as a British city, and it grew in its own way, of course, as an Atlantic port city. And I've always thought of Charleston as a sea-facing history. It's one of the things that makes Charleston so great, and Charlestonians who know their history and love their history so great is they see themselves as outwardly facing, not inwardly facing. And I think Dickens captures that in that his own reflection in 1861. Charleston grows out of the waves, but the heat in Charleston is an African heat. It's such a beautiful quote. I want to share another quick quote here before I dive into an example for you from the text. And here we're in the introduction and we're talking about Gadsden's Wharf. And Gadsden's Wharf is this really fascinating space historically for the transatlantic slave trade and for economic trade and the growth of Charleston materially, but then today as a site of the mapping on of the International African American Museum and for the cruise ships that come and go each year in Charleston. And impact in this one port city geography of Gadsden's Wharf is this kind of history that we are trying to capture in this book. How do we place past and present on top of one another? And here's what Blake and I wrote. Port city geographies still hold the histories of brutal and commingled watery connections. Gadsden's Wharf, for example, where the city meets the Cooper River and the Atlantic Ocean, is a liminal space where the journey of sailors and slaves merged with the history of the city and the surrounding landscape. The beaches of nearby Sullivan's Island, today marked by thousands of recreational tourists, was also the location of both a major Revolutionary War battle and where slave cargo ships waited in quarantine, and the point at which some enslaved Africans first stepped foot in North America. Bounding this contemporary landscape of a port city like Charleston in a historical wharf of timelessness, connecting past and present, is emblematic of the troubled entanglements of past and present, of the vicissitudes of slavery and the vagrancies of romantic tourism. It's as if two ships, the past and the present, were passing in the night, riding the same waves and winds, seeking the same destination, but unaware of the other's presence. That's what sparked a fire for us in this book. This is a book that you could look at and say it's not Charleston's history. It's not a biography of Charleston. It's not a history of Charleston proper, or how a lot of scholars have thought of Charleston's history. But this is our collective refraction of Charleston's history, coming at it as someone who has a specialty in British Atlantic history and someone who has a specialty in the Caribbean. This is the sort of product of our experiences and collective journey of seeing this town and seeing it in light of the broader international connections that Charleston has always had and continues to have. I want to give you an example of that from the book that I'll pull together some material from chapter 2 and later from chapters 4 and 5 in an anecdote. And the anecdote is really about Sullivan's Island and seeing Sullivan's Island as this transatlantic space of a port city. The 18th century German naturalist, he was one of these collectors. He was German visiting North America. His name was Johann David Schumpf. He described the Carolina Low Country in the late 18th century. This is something that Charlestonians, I've heard in various versions, still say, is in the spring is a paradise. Does anyone know where I'm going with this? No. In the summer is hell, and in the autumn is a hospital. There are versions that have mimetically survived for Charlestonians even to this day, of versions of that phrase. In May of 1755, so the spring of Charleston, it was anything but a paradise, however. So it was about the same time that this German naturalist was visiting Charleston, North America. And on that day, a British slave ship by the name of the Matilda arrived in the port of Charleston and was set up and quarantined at Sullivan's Island. Before it arrived in Charleston, it had been at the port of Bonny, very famous in the transatlantic slave trade, current-day Nigeria, and it was there that it collected somewhere the British records from the Admiralty, the ADM records suggest somewhere between 375 and 400 enslaved people, and it arrived in Charleston. The ship's surgeon, which we know from the archival records from the British archives, says that soon after leaving the port of Bonny, that a massive outbreak of smallpox occurred amongst the enslaved population on the ship. We know from across hundreds of slave ships from this period that would have not been an uncommon experience. By the time that this slave ship, the Matilda, arrived at Sullivan's Island, the ship's captains knew that the legal protocol in Charleston at that time was that any ship carrying infectious passengers with infectious disease had to quarantine instead of coming into the harbor. And at that time in 1755, this was a relatively new law for about a 40-year period in Charleston's history. All passengers had to disembark from the ship and arrive and land on Sullivan's Island. Before this, Charleston has one of the oldest quarantine laws anywhere in North America. It actually goes back to 1698. And before that, it was only individuals who were either presently sick on their body or were recently sick had to disembark. But there's this period at the height of the transatlantic slave trade in Charleston where all people, when an outbreak had occurred, had to disembark. So imagine somewhere, we don't know how many died en route, but probably about anywhere from 250 to 300 enslaved people getting off a slave ship at Sullivan's Island and landing physically on the beach. The enslaved people were forced out of their clothes. They were medically inspected by a Charleston port doctor, and they were, as the Port City doctor's diary of that day notes, sufficiently purged using a combination of tobacco and ipecac, which would have made them throw up. And under 18th century medical doctrine, that was a well-known remedy for a serious case of infectious disease, get the bad humors out. He also then noted that their pustules, those that survived, had scabbed over, and their bodies were prepared for sale at the Charleston market. One key moment of preparing those bodies was to shave the hair off those bodies. And if you know anything about smallpox, it is a severely debilitating disease that if you survive leaves scabs all over your body. So imagine, and scholars have written a lot about the horrors of the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade. Disembarking off that slave ship and arriving on land again here in the beaches of Sullivan's Island and having that as your first encounter. And we thought a lot about, in preparing this volume, Charleston's multifaceted history. And I'm a historian of the British Atlantic, and my specialty is disease and medicine and the environment. And this is a story that, this one slave ship that was not uncommon to hundreds of slave ships that arrived in Charleston at this period, that really stuck with me is how do we connect this one experience of thousands of enslaved Africans arriving in Charleston for the first time and their defining experience as a doctor examining them naked and then going through this medicalized regime. This is what it meant to arrive in Charleston. And so I paint that picture to you, but I want to paint another one as well about smallpox and Sullivan's Island and Charleston. And that is, Charleston also has been the center of innovation as well. So smallpox was one of the most debilitating diseases along yellow fever in the 18th and the early 19th century. And it was actually a group of Charleston doctors, a lot of the same doctors that had been trained in Edinburgh or in Philadelphia, that started the Medical University of South Carolina, that were conducting some of the most famous experiments on yellow fever and smallpox. So, for example, in 1738, during an outbreak of smallpox in Charleston, James Kilpatrick, who was an Irish-born doctor living in Charleston, he performed the single largest inoculation experiment, doing live arm-to-arm inoculation. Over 1,000 Charlestonians signed up for that experiment. It was called purchasing the disease in that period because you had to pay a doctor to inoculate you. Later on, 20 years later in 1760, this guy over here, Alexander Garden, who I noticed when I walked in, I was talking to Gabriel, there's an exhibit for him over there. He was a noted naturalist in the 18th century. He was also a doctor from the University of Edinburgh. He conducted another experiment on smallpox inoculation, inoculating 2,000 Charlestonians. This was completely unheard of anywhere in the Atlantic world. There was nowhere where mass experimentation on new medical remedies was being tried than other than in Charleston. Garden's really fascinating. He comes up in this book a couple times and in my own research. Garden was a famed naturalist. He sent more specimens of plants. So think about all the ways that port cities exchange bodies, goods, things. He was exchanging more plants and animal species to Carl von Linnaeus, the famous botanist, than anyone in North America. He was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War, so the Charlestonians kicked him out. And he went back to London, and where he was vice president of the Royal Society and lived out his days. And finally, I'll just mention to you that in the early 19th century, when smallpox vaccination was discovered by Edward Jenner, this English country doctor, it was actually a Charleston physician by the name of David Ramsey, who lived 92 Broad. You've all probably passed his former house, several times. It was Ramsey who first used imported calf lymph to do vaccination in the U.S., the single largest vaccination attempt for smallpox. And I mention these two sides of this disease history because it was only in a port city like Charleston that something like this could have happened. And that's what fascinated us in putting this volume together, so much about port cities. Charleston has its own history and historical stories, and it's a rich, rich history. And we sort of came at this in a very different angle, as to say, well, how does Charleston refract out across the Atlantic world? And hopefully that small anecdote sort of paints a picture to you to the kind of stories that appear in this volume.
Thank you for that. In those campaigns for inoculation in Charleston, they reverberated across the Atlantic world. They were being studied in Boston, and Philadelphia, and London, and they're citing Kilpatrick, and we talk about that in the volume. But we have to give credit to the community that helped us create this volume. We did not write every single chapter. We read them multiple times. We edited them. We spent many years with these chapters that they became part of our knowledge base. But this began as a collaborative project at the College of Charleston with the CLAW program, the Carolina Low Country and Atlantic World program, and our colleagues at CLAW really taught us along the way. For me, that's the beauty of being a college professor. You learn with your colleagues, you learn with your students, and you learn with your community, and it never ends. This was going to be a conference. It was going to happen in May 2020. Jacob and I were part of the steering committee to get that conference organized. Very soon after that, we realized that some of those things that contributors were talking about in their panel proposals were now playing out in 2020, right? Global pandemics and diseases and quarantines, which we ended up writing about. And we said, well, how are we going to pivot out of this? We read the best proposals, we found those folks, we talked to them, we had exchanges, and we said, let's make a book out of this. I guess, what was that, 3 years later? We had other things going on as well, but we focused on this for the last 3 years. So I just want to say thank you to CLAW, the program, our director, Dr. Slater, and the other members who made this possible. And to realize that the College of Charleston has a deep connection to this society here, to the Library Society. And thank you for those ancestors for creating the positions that allow us to then go back and have contact and relationships with the community.
Yeah, thank you so much, Blake. Yeah, and also to give a shout out here to University of South Carolina Press, who published this volume. And this book was published in the Carolina Low Country Atlantic World series, which is a long-running series with the University of South Carolina Press. Some of the authors have been through Charleston in past years, and I believe in amongst this very group and given similar talks to this. So I just want to acknowledge that legacy. I want to pause here and have Blake and I kind of go back and forth and ask each other some questions in the time that we have left about this volume and its significance. And then we'll open it up for y'all to ask questions and have a broader dialogue, because this history that we're exploring here is all of our histories as Charlestonians.
But before we do that, let's just make very clear. If you like the book, it's me. And if there are issues, so go ahead and ask your question.
Let's see how it is.
So
we have, so far in our short presentation today, we've talked a lot about some of the stories that have interested us from the 18th century. And this book actually starts in our first chapter even before that, in the 17th century, and the way in which the pre-port history of the port of Charleston, of indigenous Charleston, was functioning, and the slave trade of indigenous peoples was happening already in the 17th century, and some of the conflicts with the British and the French and the Spanish. But this book is a journey, and it's a journey that starts in the 17th century and it ends all the way until today. And we talked a little bit about some of the early chronological periods of this book, but it's a book that follows Charleston and the Atlantic world to New Orleans and hurricanes. And it's a book that travels to the Caribbean, and it travels to Europe, and it travels to Africa. And it really does span the Atlantic world. But we come firmly back at the end of this book to Charleston, and to think about Charleston and its history and its legacy. And one of the last chapters in this book talks about the environmental stewardship of the land and our coastlines. And that's something that Blake, that you've been really involved with, not only as a scholar of the environment, but someone that's been in Charleston involved with the Marsh Project and several other environmental sustainability groups. And I wondered if, now that we're on the back end of this journey and this book is out and we've sort of been on our own intellectual journey of thinking about Charleston in the vicissitudes of port cities, what is environmental stewardship and environmental sustainability in Charleston mean? These are some of the biggest topics that we hear in this town today. What does it mean reflecting on this history?
I'll start with a vignette that when I first arrived to Charleston, before I ever got a job here, I arrived by the water. And I worked on boats for many years, crewing on boats and captaining boats, and I saw Charleston from the perspective of the water, and that never left me. And one of my relationships was doing charter boats in Charleston, going out the Ashley River, and telling a sailor's history of Charleston. So that informed this book. But as I would look back on the land, I was so baffled by the proximity of buildings up to certain parts of the river, whether it was the Cooper or the Ashley or the Wando, and other parts where I could see vast savannas of marshland, and reminding of my youth in parts of Florida that were protected on the Canaveral National Seashore. And I was trying to figure out the difference between where do I see marsh and where do I see the built environment. And it was all about access to the water and deep water. And that's why real estate in Charleston remains, if you have access to a deep water port, whether it's a dock for recreational purposes or a dock for commercial purposes, the land value increases dramatically. And all of us want to get to the water. And that was the beginning of Charleston's history. Even the Kiowa knew this. They said, let's give the English settlers a place where they have deep water, and we can limit their access to deep water inland so we can control the trade. So from the very beginning, it's all about proximity to deep water, and that's still ongoing. So that's where you think about changes and continuities. The continuity is the water and access to deep water. Now my work with environmental stewardship is specifically about how do we have a historical reconciliation with the way we've treated marshes over time. Not only because we care about other species and other ecological dynamics, but for our own survival as a city, we're going to have to repair our relationships with marshes. And so I founded a nonprofit with some friends called the Marsh Project, the Marsh Appreciation Restoration Society for Happiness. We don't have to beat ourselves for all the historical mistakes. We can also have joy in the process of remembering history. And so that's where I see environmental stewardship. This might be a moment for us to deal with the past and still enjoy life, right? We all share the environment, and we can all share those marshes, and hopefully have community access to the water, deep water and shallow. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I do have a question for you.
I'm not prepared for this.
As an historian of disease, I would like you to tell us more about how you think your previous research, it's more of a comment as a question here, but how you think your previous research informed the way you think about port cities, and specifically Charleston. So tell us a little bit about that previous book and how it bled in to your thoughts on Charleston.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I, I've spent my entire career thinking about the modern history of infectious disease and how disease mediates our population. It's one of the great leveling forces of the human experience, but we experience disease differentially as individuals and as groups of individuals based on known biological and evolutionary phenomenon. But disease at once knows no national boundaries. It's one of the most fascinating things about it, and we've all experienced this in the last 3 years. And yet how we react is inherently cultural and national and humanistic. And that's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, both through historical examples during the last 3 years, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then reflecting on this book and Charleston's history. One of the things that I think is really fascinating about thinking about disease and situating disease in the human experience is we can liken in some ways outbreaks of disease to disasters. People often want to say that there are man-made disasters or human-made disasters and natural disasters, and in some ways these are completely false dichotomies, right? So that an evolution of a virus, a mutation of a virus can wreak havoc on a population in a similar way that a hurricane can wreak havoc on a population. And yet, the way in which we reckon with these phenomenon, these natural phenomenon, are entirely of our own doing. How we prepare for them or don't prepare for them, how we show care for others during these moments. And ports play an important role for that. And in a very basic way, of course, as maps like this suggest from the 18th century, and this is a very 18th century type of thinking of how ports were connected, ports are sites of the entrance of disease, and they're sites of where disease moves from place to place. They're nodes in these networks. But we as humans experience this phenomenon. And in a way, I think that tells us something really deeply important about our humanity. One of the things that I talk to people a lot in public talks in Charleston, which I've given a lot during in the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, because Charleston has, in my opinion, the richest history of disease and medicine of any city in the Atlantic world. I really firmly believe this. And one of my next book projects is a medical history of Charleston. So be on the lookout for that. And Charleston's experience, I think, at one level tells us, as we were, struggling through COVID, and as Blake and I were struggling to finish this volume during COVID-19 pandemic, so all these things are like layering onto one another in a fascinating way, is that this too shall pass. I remember telling people that, and you look at the history and you say, there's a smallpox epidemic in Charleston that kills 500 people 1 year, and 3 years later it kills 800 people, and 10 years later, these are cyclical kind of biological events. But they're ones that determine people's lives and fundamentally shape the contours of people's lives. And they're ones that determine our collective ethos. And so I think in that regard, how we prepare for diseases matters in a similar way for how we prepare for disasters. And I've lived in this city long enough. So in my 13 years here, we've had major hurricanes over half of the time since 2010. And that is absolutely, as someone who is not from the coastal low country, absolutely fascinating to think about and to live through, and to think about disaster preparedness and how chains of human decisions lead us to the impact that these disasters have. That's true of, I think hurricanes and fires and diseases as well. So, this book is part of this ongoing conversation that I've been having to students, to members of the community, to really think about and situate moments of disease and disaster, not as episodic ones that somehow come out of nowhere, because I don't think they do. They're actually, we should reasonably anticipate another major infectious disease in a similar way as we should anticipate another hurricane or another fire. And I think in that way, this history helps us, but it's only when we see this history as a living history, that goes back to a point that Blake made earlier, in a history of connectivity. I mean, we only sort of fail to understand the accumulation of historical knowledge when we see things as local and isolated, and when we can see them as interconnected and over long chains of time and space, and living in the present, that I think we can begin to reckon with them.
I have to throw something here to Jacob, but that working with him in particular, I learned so much about the role of ports and the relationship to the history of medicine and disease, and that ports were really at the cutting edge of innovation for dealing with this, because they're the first ones to experience it. As a disease moves across space, it's arriving on ships. Right? Ships are not exactly healthy environments. They're also bringing different environments into contact, and you have to deal with it at the port. And so you begin to think about some of the dual language that you can think about for the history of a port. It's a vector. It's a contact zone. It could also apply to the history of medicine. And I really enjoyed working with someone who knew that from the inside out as a field.
So I want to transition away from the morbid stuff to maybe the slightly less morbid stuff, although the Charlestonians will have some vexed position on this. And that is the sort of giant elephant in the room that we haven't talked about so far, but that is everywhere imprinted on this book, is that Charleston grows and evolves historically into this tourist destination. And you know, this history that we recount in this book, and you know, Charleston's incredible history becomes this history of tourism in the course of the 19th and throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century. And I wonder, Blake, if you could reflect a little bit on how, you know, this book contributes in our thinking as people that are Charlestonians and that live in Charleston, and, you know, think about these historical questions of the present, to see how tourism weighs in your own thinking.
Well, I've got an easy solution for this. I think this book should be assigned on every cruise ship that arrives at Charleston, and it should be part of the ticket and the fee, and then we won't have as many problems. But if they're not going to read it, well, we can still talk about it. I'm an historian of tourism first and foremost. I grew up in a tourist town. It's called Winter Park. It was founded for tourists, and so ingrained in me is to think about how does tourism shape the economy and culture of a place. And when I arrived at Charleston, I immediately took that framework and began to think about it. Now, granted, Charleston had a deep history before it became a tourist destination, but the attractions that bring tourists, whether they're consciously acknowledging it or not, or it's in the subconscious, are this accumulated history into the present. And so what you think is a good meal might be related to Gullah Geechee history or Southern cuisine, the mixing of Black and African and indigenous traditions, even if you're not thinking about it. So there are two planes in which you have to deal with history in terms of tourism. The conscious, in terms of what you think the attraction is and your love for history, and the subconscious, which is the material locations and values in which you then visit a place. Let's try to get it to the conscious as much as possible and offer various narratives from different perspectives rather than just one narrative in terms of the consciousness. Now, I maybe spoke a little too philosophical there, but...
No, I mean, I think that resonates with me too. Maybe just to piggyback on that a little bit, because, you know, and Carl used another really academic-y word that I think everybody here understands, but it's an important one, of creolization, right? Of ports being these creole spaces, these mixed spaces. And I think that's a concept that sort of, if we take it out of the academy, I think is really easy to understand, of like, it presumes no weight of importance on one part of the Creole than the other. And I think that's really important for thinking about Charleston's history and how it relates to ongoing questions about tourism and their tensions in this town, right? I think their economic tensions and cultural tensions, their business tensions.
Let's go back to the very beginning. I didn't say this in the opening vignette of the talk, but right next to the story of this slave ship that arrives in 1783, just 2 weeks after the Treaty of Paris, we talk about the fact that on those same wharves, on that same part of the Cooper River, you now have cruise ships and tourists visiting those locations. So what does it mean to have a port of entry for slavery, and then you have tourists arriving on those same locations, not thinking about the layers of history there? Now, I know Charleston is trying to deal with this, and I think the International African American Museum in that area is a really important step in the right direction. But that's a sort of key. If we're thinking of Charleston's history as bookends, we have to think about indigenous history, the interaction between colonial competition between the Spanish and the French and the English, and then we take it up to tourism. And let's see what the future chapters will look like. But those are the two ones that we have to, at some point, weave together from A to the present.
Yeah. And these are, of course, I mean, one of the things that more than anything else that I learned in the process of working with Blake and the other authors who would contribute to this volume and thinking about Charleston's history is it's just how much these are ongoing conversations, and we are always reinterpreting Charleston's history, and that's really positive. I mean, as a historian, that's something that I think is really powerful to acknowledge and to think about, and how a lot of these questions, and I think Blake and I are both on the same page here, these are community questions, and they're questions about community engagement for all of us that live here, or even for folks who are transients here and here temporarily. But because this history is a living history, and Charleston is unique in so many ways. I mean, all of the reasons for which Charleston becomes the single largest point of entry for enslaved Africans in the 18th and early 19th century, that matters for our history today. The innovations that Charleston, that were centered in Charleston, they matter for the nation's founding today. Some of the smallpox inoculation experiments that I talked about earlier, the British heard about them because they were being reported on. And so when the Revolutionary War started, British troops were mandated to be inoculated for smallpox. Washington held out on that, and he only begrudgingly did it once he learned that the British were mandating smallpox inoculation, and he went back and he read what the Charleston doctors were saying from their big experiments. These histories really matter, and they matter for bigger questions than just the local history of these streets. I don't want to say that Charleston's history isn't exceptional, because I think in some really important ways it is, but it's part of these big, broader networks of the Atlantic world that in this volume we try to speak to provide a kind of model for thinking about Charleston's big history and big connections for future people to continue other studies.
I think what's unique about it is the particular constellation of transnational connections that made Charleston. And it's a pattern that you can then think about for other Atlantic world cities. Think about the particular constellation of connections that then showed up there. Similar patterns, but who's going where and what commodity or what disease showed up changed, whether it was in Cartagena or on the coast of West Africa, or if it was London, or it was New York, if it was Charleston, but similar types of transnational patterns of connections. So a question I have for Jacob, it's a bit of a downer question, but maybe there's a pick-me-up on the other side. The relationship of disaster to ports and an historical perspective, because I know you think about this a lot, and I'm trying to grapple with it, because what are we going to do when the next disaster comes, and what can we learn from the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I alluded to this earlier, but I think that this is one of the big historical questions of the present that the city of Charleston is not unique in facing, but it is one of our ongoing struggles, is how to prepare infrastructurally for the next hurricane, for example, but also culturally and mentally in our population here in this city. And I think, I keep urging students, something I really, truly, truly believe in, working with, exceptional undergrads at the College of Charleston and with graduate students. And I direct our graduate program in history at the College of Charleston as well. And I keep telling them, there are some great studies of some of the disasters that have happened in Charleston, some of the hurricanes and the fires. And, there's a couple really famous ones from the late 19th century, for example, that many of you here probably know about. But this history is an ongoing one in Charleston's history. So I keep telling students, go find a hurricane that no one's talked about in Charleston. Go find one and write a whole master's thesis on it. Let's find out how Charlestonians, the collective knowledge, not just an isolated, really big hurricane that knocked down Charleston, or there's knowledge about Hugo, but what about the hundreds of hurricanes that have hit this town? The quarantine station at Sullivan's Island, the contemporary maps often struggle to place where it was, and that's because over its very long history of over 100 years, there was a physical structure there, as I was telling Malcolm before I talked today. But hurricanes destroyed it about every year or every other year, so they had to keep rebuilding it. It's one of the reasons that we have good archival records in this town, fairly good for the quarantine station at Sullivan's Island. But that deep knowledge of how to prepare for disasters should not take us by surprise. And I think it's through studying the collective history of this town and comparing it to other towns and these connections and other port cities that I think that we may be able to grapple with in some new and unique ways.
And what we saw as we were doing the study is that every time there was a disaster, there was a new innovation or opportunism involved in the process. Some of you are probably familiar with like a post-Hugo phenomenon. There are different historical iterations of this in terms of how do people react, benefit, and adapt, whether it's a disease or a hurricane or a fire. I just want to walk you through the chapters real quick. We have our introduction, but we start with the indigenous history of Charleston and the role of the Kiowa and the settlement indigenous communities along the coast and their relationship with the English in competing with other indigenous groups and also competing with the Spanish and the French, and specifically why Charleston is founded based on indigenous interests and knowledge rather than just what the English wanted. They invited them. There's this Charleston myth that the English were invited, and that's actually true because they were concerned about wars with other competing indigenous groups. So that's one chapter. Then we move to Sullivan's Island and questions of quarantine and the transatlantic slave trade. Then we do a comparative analysis with Charleston and New York, and our author comes to the conclusion that New York was as dependent on slavery as Charleston, this back and forth dynamic. Then we move to Jacob's specialty with disease and disaster. You want to walk us through those?
Yep. So we've got, in the second part, we have 3 chapters. The first looks at hurricanes and fires in the port city of New Orleans. And so we sort of shift from Charleston to New Orleans and see some of the interesting ways in which, and especially on a day like today, thinking about New Orleans and Mardi Gras, to see how New Orleans was rebuilt in the wake of Atlantic hurricanes and fires. Then we have a second chapter in that section of the book that's on big global debates over yellow fever quarantine and diplomatic debates that were happening all across the Atlantic world. And then we have a third chapter in that section that is on Atlantic world inoculation experiments that I've talked about already in my part of the talk this evening.
And I'll do this very quickly. The last section is called Protest, Conservation, and Tourism in the Low Country. And we take those previous chapters to then think about contemporary issues. So we have an author talking about black resistance and liberation movements around ports and how ports became permissive spaces for protest and creativity in the black community. We've got another chapter on conservative conservation. What happened to all the wealth generated by these maritime connections, and how did it go into land ownership across the Low Country? Then we've got a chapter on tourism and nostalgia for this past. And then we have an afterword from the former director of CLAW, Simon Lewis, who takes an analysis and thinks about his childhood in Cape Town, South Africa, also growing up in the UK, and then spending the last quarter of a century in Charleston, and seeing home in Charleston and those other places as well. Literally, the bricks came from one of his hometowns in Charleston, right? From the UK. So that's the gist of it.
Yeah, we'll stop now, and we would love to open this up to a dialogue and a conversation, and to bring the collective wisdom of the group to weigh in on any of the issues here that anyone has questions about, or comments, or anything to enlighten us as we continue our own journey of thinking about Charleston. And there's some microphones that will be circulating.
Yes, to aid that collective wisdom, 2 microphones. So look for Michael and Dakota, and please speak into the tip of the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks for all that great work you've done. What about the sickle cell trait of the Africans who could then survive in the rice fields without getting malaria?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Ralph. Thank you. This was actually in the 18th century, one of the hot topics amongst the Charleston doctors was what we today would call differential immunity, which at the time they have no 21st century idea of immunity or how the immune system works or resistance. But they did observe that particularly for diseases for which an attack the first time confers lifelong immunity, that if you were attacked in childhood and survived, then you would not come down and die from that disease later in life. And that was one of the reasons that some, not all Charleston doctors, many of whom also were plantation doctors throughout the Low Country corridor of plantations on the Ashley River, were used to support enslaved African labor and the importation of more enslaved Africans, certainly. That was part of that discussion, couched in a very different sort of medical, cosmology of the 18th century, but certainly was one that was practically kind of observed, even in the 18th century.
I have a comment about the 1760 smallpox epidemic. There was a lot of conversation in the newspaper about inoculation, and women were having inoculation parties for their children. They were getting together and having all the children be inoculated so that they would be, and made it a party. On the other hand, the slave owners in the Charleston also members of the General Assembly. And since they could see that inoculated and non-inoculated slaves were dying just as fast as everybody else, that there had been a law against inoculation.
Yeah.
They decided they would scrap the law and see what would happen. So
Yeah.
it has echoes of what the politics of disease has to say today.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a twisting story in the 18th century, as you allude to. So thank you so much for that. And one thing that I've thought a lot about that's reflected in this book, and is ongoing in some of my own research about Charleston's history, is why is it that Charleston's home, if anywhere in the Atlantic world, is some of the biggest experiments on inoculation? It's a totally fascinating and fundamentally important question for not just Charleston, but a really big set of debates that were happening over medical experimentation, that were happening over questions over slavery and immunity that Ralph mentioned earlier, and questions ultimately about the role of government and liberal subjectivity, they would call it. So yeah, thank you for that.
I think I had the microphone. Can you put today's commercial port in Charleston in the context of the history of the Atlantic world?
Well, that's a great question. We should write another book on that one. You have so much technological evolution. It's hard to compare entirely, but I think about this very much from a 20th century perspective in terms of how the U.S. expanded commercially. If you look at the Panama Canal, that's sort of a classic place to think about how Charleston fit into a shifting Atlantic world that almost went more to the Pacific, right, over time. That we are now dredging the Charleston Harbor so that we can have Neo-Panama ships pass through the Panama Canal and get to Charleston and get to the Asiatic markets, so that China and so on. But every phase of Charleston's history is about adapting to that maritime trade. So if it's West Africa and European focused, the ships are relying on sail and taking those routes. When there's more connections to the Indian Ocean, there's new routes forming. Right? I don't think it ever stops. It just evolves. Even the arrival of the U.S. Navy in the naval base in North Charleston is about commercial expansion into the Caribbean and Latin America. Your question is so big and omnipresent. It's hard to give you a specific answer, except that it hasn't stopped. Now, one of the things that we have seen with technology are there fewer jobs in relationship to the maritime trade. You don't need as many dock workers. You don't need as many longshoremen. You don't need as many sailors as well. So the number of people who are directly involved in the maritime trade is fewer, but the economy is still deeply interwoven into the relationship with it. And the routes shift, but they're still coming to the port.
Blake, I know you've worked as a charter captain.
Oh, yes.
I am also a full-time charter captain. I'm also a nerd. And on my tours, I share a lot about local history and local ecology. And what I've learned is that the average American doesn't actually know a lot of history. And I have grappled with what they know of coming from Hollywood and other media. For example, Disney. The history of piracy could not be more false. Piracy is actually just slave history. It wasn't golden rums. They were rum bottles. They were stealing slaves. One of the stories I tell is that Blackbeard held our harbor hostage for 2 weeks to get his first syringe, to try to get people to think more authentically about what history here would be like. But as a tourism-facing individual, I struggle between telling facts and creating an enjoyable tour. So how do you suggest us tourism-facing individuals share truth?
Yes.
It's like there's a level of intuitiveness required for when do you insert certain elements of your narrative and when do you When do you tell the fun parts? Because there are beautiful stories of survival and adventure and creativity, but they also have to be interwoven with the realities of tragedy and violence and all the other terrible things that happen. One of the things that I've always tried to emphasize is the diversity of experiences and people who've been through Charleston. I think that is an easy angle that we can all talk about. And people seem to enjoy the thought of connecting with people of different experiences and from different places. They like to feel cosmopolitan, right? So one of the first things I would do when I would take people on a charter boat was starting on the Ashley River. I would say, this is the river of three names. Right? It was first the Kiowa River, and then I had an excuse to talk about indigenous history and what happened. Then I would talk about Spanish. It was also the San Jorge River when the Spanish claimed all of La Florida up to this point. And then they renamed it the Ashley River, and then I would get into Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper and the founding of Charleston. So I was able to talk about history in a diverse way, but in each of those angles, deal with the yin and the yang of that experience.
Yeah, very similar in my experience too. And I've developed over the years a Charleston's medical history walking tour of Charleston, and I've taken a very similar approach. It's very easy to either glamorize or to go into the doom and gloom, and I think finding some perspective there that helps people to see that this all isn't just revisionism, and we're just here to make people feel bad about themselves by looking at history, because really that doesn't do anything to spark in people's interest in history and to keep it alive. But I think reckoning with history is also really deeply important, and we need to do that at the same time. So I think it's just finding that balance, which is an ongoing project for all of us that love the past and communicate about the past. Ultimately, I think, and this is something that Blake and I talk a lot about just philosophically and just as people who love history, is just telling stories. And what do those stories mean? And we as scholars of history know that the choices that we make about whose stories get privileged and whose stories get silenced really matter. They deeply matter. That's sort of the ethical, moral role of all forms of historians, publicly and academically and writ large. And so I think taking that storytelling really ethically and morally responsibly is something that I take really, really seriously, just as a person who communicates about the past. And based on your question, I don't know you, but based on your question, I know you do too, which is that's the way. So the only answer is keep grappling with how to do that.
Ends of stories are always nice too. We have to be hopeful at some point. So if you can end in some sort of feeling of hope, you can keep people going. I think of jazz, for instance. You can't get to jazz if you don't get through all the tragedy and the suffering and the hardship and the creativity. But then when you listen to jazz, that's great. Right? So I think you can think about Charleston's history that way as well.
I believe we have time for one more, and we have it right there.
So I was listening when you referred to the experimentation and Jenner, and I was thinking, why didn't we hear earlier about Cotton Mather in Boston? He inoculated his family, and everybody railed against it, including Benjamin Franklin took him on.
Yeah.
But he had trusted his slave to inoculate. I remember reading in Erskine Clark's book that there was a plantation outside of Beaufort where they inoculated the entire slave population. The slaves did it. The whites wouldn't listen to them. So I'm really wondering that you left out that it had evolved earlier on the African continent, and yet we still credit a white man.
Yeah.
It's in here.
No, we definitely don't. It's not left out of the story. And the origins of smallpox. So two things: inoculation, which was the arm-to-arm, practice that was happening. We don't even know how long before in parts of Africa, in the Middle East, and in China. A very old folk medical practice that Europeans only learned about in the early 18th century, right? And they inherited that medical knowledge. And there was also, one of the reasons, and this was alluded to earlier with the experiments of Garden, by the middle of the 18th century, there was a lot of skepticism amongst populations across North America, white populations, for inoculation. One, there were religious objections, very reasonable religious objections of tampering with God's plan. And then two, there were fears that this practice was from somewhere else. It was an African practice, or it was a Middle Eastern practice, or it was a Chinese practice. So there was xenophobia around it too. And I think it's only out of the sort of port city mixing port of Charleston that all these things come to a head. And there's, like Blake was mentioning, there's innovation that happens out of this Creole space of a port city like Charleston. That, yeah, there's inoculation debates happening in Boston and in New York and in Philadelphia, and people talk a lot about role of Cotton Mather, right? But the real innovation spurs out of Charleston, out of this intense collection of bodies coming and going, and in part it's the nature of the port city of Charleston, I think, that makes that happen.
But those stories were in dialogue too, right? That what was going on with Cotton Mather and New England was also being discussed in Charleston and back and forth. And we do talk in the book about how Cotton Mather got this information from a man who was enslaved by him, right? And that was the beginning of his awakening on thinking in that way.
Well, Dr. Scott, Dr. Steere-Williams, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all so much.